This course is a mini course in data management, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this module, is the data and the calculations and how to go back and forth between data that you gather and calculations in TICE. What we are doing is quantifying emissions. That's what TICE does. A natural gas plant that burns natural gas to turn turbines in one form or another and generate electricity, for example, can emit 1,000 tons a year of NOx, 50 tons a day carbon monoxide from on-road vehicles just in Phoenix alone, 50 tons a day, 10 pounds a year of mercury emitted from a small coal-fired electricity generating station. So 10 pounds a year, you can see mercury is emitted in far less quantities. However, it's really, really dangerous. A tablespoonful of mercury put in a 20-acre lake over the span of a year can make all the fish in that lake dangerous for people to eat. So even though it's a lot less, mercury and other heavy metals emissions have really, really big consequences. How are emissions estimated? Well, keep in mind that everything is an estimate. Even when you monitor at the source with what's called continuous emissions monitoring or source testing, where they make measurements of what's coming out of the stack or out of the facility at different parts of the process, those are estimates also, because they're not measuring every single bit of air that's emitted from that facility. They're taking a sample from different stacks, so those even are estimates. They may be the best estimates, but what we're doing in TICE is using models that EPA uses and is similar to what everybody else is doing to estimate these emissions. EPA has different models, and there's information in TICE about how the calculators were derived and what models they use. Another method is material balance, and that's basically when you look at all the material that comes into a facility in terms of the raw material, and then what gets shipped out of the facility, either in the form of electricity or heat or emissions. Then you look at the material balance, what went in and what's going out. This stuff has to be somewhere. So that's another really good way of estimating what is emitted. Emission factors are factors that take into account the model that was used and say, okay, if you are in a particular type of process and you have this amount of what's called activity or throughput data, for example, just gallons of gas burned in a car, then what does the car emit of a particular pollutant that's based upon the emission factors? So these emission factors, AP42 is a compilation of emission factors that EPA makes available. And for example, an emission factor would look at the pounds of mercury emitted per ton of coal burned. The activity data, that's the data that you're going to have to go out and gather, either by counting cars, talking to the source, doing a lot of internet research. If you can't get information from the source, there's a lot of material online. And basically what you need is like the throughput, the activity data, in order to use that in conjunction with the emissions factor, which is in TICE, to estimate what's actually emitted for a particular pollutant. The basic equation, and this is part of TICE, is that what's emitted is equal to the emission factor that's in TICE and the emissions rate. Again, we usually talk about annual emissions, and the activity. This A is the activity. That's the cords of wood burned. That's the acreage of a field where pesticide is applied. That's the vehicle miles traveled on different stretches of road. That's what's happening, the process that you have to gather information about in order to estimate the emissions caused by that process. So how do you get the necessary data? Directly from the source? Many sources keep records and are happy to provide them. Many have permits that they have applied for from various authorities, granting permits. That could be the tribe, that could be the county, that could be the state, that could be the federal government. A lot of this material is available online with monitoring information, actual measurements made at the stack. A lot of times that information is available from EPA's website, or you could look at a similar facility. Questionnaires and surveys, those would be things that you would use in the case, for example, for wood stoves. If you're not sure how many people on your land use wood stoves and what kind to heat their homes, that would be something that you could find out perhaps through the use of a survey. So for each type of source, we're going to talk about data collection. So that's what the information is that you have to gather. So we're going to have slides on that. And then we're going to look at how you put that information into TICE, what you do in TICE with that data that you gather. And TICE has a structure somewhat based upon the NEI. The slides that we're going to talk about next explain how the data you collect gets put into TICE. For point sources, you need obviously the physical location, and you want the physical location, not a PO box. You need the stack parameters. Sometimes that information is available, sometimes it's not. But if you have this information, it's really, really highly recommended that you put whatever information you gather into TICE. The process level information, so that's after you gather the basic information about the facility, its location, and what it does. What processes? Facilities can have multiple processes. Those are the things, that's the activity that generates the emissions into the air. The process level is where you look at and select SEC codes, and that determines the calculators that you use. For the process, in some cases, it's going to be a complicated process and there'll be a flow diagram. Materials being consumed, obviously, so what's going into it? Is it fuel? Is it raw materials? The boiler throughput, for example. So many larger buildings like schools and community centers are heated with boilers. They may use propane, they may use natural gas. How much of that propane is used every year? Operating schedules, that can be critical, especially with seasonal activities. And then if you have any information, and it's surprising how much there is on control devices. If there's some system in place to trap some of the emissions, that information obviously is critical. This is a screenshot of a handout that's in your folder, and it looks at what is going on in TICE in parallel with what is going on at the facility. So obviously the facility information, the site name, physical location, release points. So a lot of times that is fugitive, especially for smaller sources. So there's no specific release points, it's just a process like a bulldozer that releases dust into the air without any sort of control or vent. The emission units, that may, for example, this looks like it's a sawmill. So there are debarkers at sawmills, there are hog cyclones at sawmills, and each of those would be a unit, like a physical thing, where something happens and air pollution is emitted from that emission unit. And then processes, because you could have an emission unit with multiple processes. So don't get confused by this, just treat every case as a new case and do the research, and we will be here to help you go through this. The processes, for example, this you see you've got SEC codes. So log debarking would be a code for the process, and then that dictates what calculator is used. This could be dried trees and ends chipped, and that's a process with a different SEC code. Again, the time frame is usually annual, and the emissions, which is the end result of all this, if you get that information from a permit, for example, estimated emissions are often on permits, you can enter that into TICE, or if you gather the throughput, the activity data, you can use TICE to calculate that.